The hollow was a bowl of perpetual twilight, a place where the sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy of ancient oaks and hickories, and the air always hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. For the Winthrop family, this isolated corner of Appalachia was both a sanctuary and a prison. The year was 1862, and while the nation tore itself apart in a brutal civil war, the Winthrops lived in a world defined by the rhythms of their own making, the chop of an axe, the murmur of a prayer, and the deafening silence of unspoken truths. Elias Winthrop, the family's patriarch, ruled with a cold hand. A tall, gaunt man with eyes like shards of gray slate, he saw the world through the narrow lens of his own rigid faith. God's law, as he interpreted it, was an instrument of order, a tool to hammer his family into a shape of unblemished piety. His wife, Eleanor, was a shadow in the house, a woman whose spirit had been slowly eroded by years of Elias's demands and the crushing weight of their remote existence. She moved with a listless grace, her hands perpetually wringing, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the cracked panes of the cabin windows. The children, however, were a different story, a tangle of 6 young lives growing wild and untamed, despite Elias's best efforts. The boys, Thomas, Jacob, and Samuel, were a study in contrasts. Thomas, the eldest, was a quiet, sturdy boy of 19. He carried the weight of future expectations on his broad shoulders, his face a constant mask of solemn responsibility. He rarely spoke. His thoughts kept guarded behind a curtain of silent observation. Jacob, the middle son, was a year younger and all restless energy. He possessed a quick, sharp mind and a gaze that seemed to miss nothing, a simmering defiance always just beneath the surface. Samuel, a boy of 16, was the family's fragile heart. He was gentle and artistic, finding solace in sketching the gnarled trees and fleeting clouds, a boy too sensitive for a world so harsh. Then there were the triplets. Born within an hour of each other, they were as alike in appearance as they were different in spirit. Agnes, with her sharp wit and manipulative charm, was the clear leader. She had a way of turning a simple glance into a secret, a casual word into a command. She was a master of whispers, of half-truths that coiled around a person's mind. Beatrice was the quiet one, the observer. She absorbed everything, every tension, every lie, every flash of emotion, and held it all inside, a silent accomplice to her sister's designs. And finally, there was Clara, the youngest of the 3. Her eyes were wide and perpetually filled with a kind of fear, a reflection of her fragile, anxious nature. She was Agnes's willing puppet, too timid to stand on her own. The narrative of their lives was one of routine and repression. The days were long, filled with back-breaking work in the fields and tedious chores in the cabin. The nights were longer, punctuated by the creaks of the old house and the rustle of the wind through the pines. But a shift began slowly, subtly, like a change in the weather. It started with the triplets. They had always shared an unbreakable bond, a conspiratorial intimacy that excluded the boys. But now, that bond was turning inward, becoming something darker. It began with Agnes. She had a way of looking at Thomas, a lingering glance that was less sisterly and more possessive. She would find reasons to be alone with him, to whisper secrets that held no real meaning but felt heavy with intent. She would praise his strength, his quiet resolve, words that no one else in the family ever offered. Thomas, starved for affection and recognition, found himself drawn to it, to her. It was a warmth he hadn't realized he was missing, and the feeling of a secret shared, even a false one, was intoxicating. Beatrice, with her silent observation, saw it all. She saw the way Agnes's touch lingered on Thomas's arm, the way her eyes would sparkle with a cold triumph when he responded. She saw the slow, creeping discomfort on Thomas's face, a look that he couldn't quite place, but that she recognized as a man stepping onto a path he could not turn back from. Beatrice said nothing. She simply watched, a silent participant in the unfolding drama. And Clara, ever the follower, watched her sisters, learning their cruel game. She began to mimic Agnes's actions, though with a clumsy, desperate eagerness. Her targets were Jacob and Samuel. To Jacob, she would offer a quiet sympathy, a shared glance of understanding when their father's wrath descended. To Samuel, she would bring him wildflowers she had gathered in the woods, a silent offering of comfort that he, in his innocence, accepted as a pure act of love. The hollow was a quiet place, but the silence was now filled with the hum of attention so thick it was almost a physical presence. The brothers, isolated by their own natures and their father's distant cruelty, were now being drawn into a web of affection and attention they had never known. The Triplet daughters, in their own desperate way, were searching for a kind of power, a control over their small world, and their brothers were the key. What they were doing wasn't an act of love, but of possession. It was a game of emotional manipulation, each sister vying for a hold on her chosen brother, a sinister competition of the heart. The very air around the Winthrop cabin seemed to grow colder, heavier, filled with an insidious, creeping dread. They were all playing a part in a story they didn't yet understand, a narrative of deceit and desire that was only just beginning. Don't miss the next part of this story. Subscribe now to the channel and enable notifications to follow the dark tale of the Winthrop family. The subtle shifts in the Winthrop household soon blossomed into a palpable sickness. It wasn't a physical ailment at first, but a rot of the spirit, a silent decay that seeped into the very foundations of their home. The Triplet daughters, once a united front, now operated as individual agents of their own quiet conspiracy. Agnes's focus was Thomas, and her approach was a slow burn of flattery and false intimacy. She would wait until Elias was out of earshot, and then, with a conspiratorial glance, she would praise Thomas's strength, his work ethic, his quiet dignity. "Father sees your work as his own," she'd whisper, her voice a soft current in the oppressive air. "But I see you, Thomas. I see how you hold us all up." Thomas, who had known only the sharp bite of his father's critique, found himself disarmed. He would look at her, a flicker of a smile on his solemn face, and for a moment, the heavy burden he carried felt a little lighter. Agnes would place a hand on his arm, a touch that was meant to be innocent, but felt charged with a strange, forbidden energy. The more she did this, the more Thomas sought her out, craving the validation she so freely offered. It was a dangerous game of a brother and a sister, where the lines blurred in the shadows of their father's gaze. Jacob, with his restless spirit, found himself caught in Clara's gentle web. She was a different kind of siren than Agnes. Clara's method was one of quiet, almost desperate need. When Elias would chastise Jacob for his rebellious streak, Clara would be the one to find him later, her wide eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. She would hand him a freshly baked piece of bread or a cup of warm milk, her touch fleeting and hesitant, a silent apology for a world they both felt suffocated by. Her quiet, fearful nature made her seem fragile, and Jacob, with a deeply buried desire to protect, found himself drawn to her need. He mistook her dependency for true affection, unaware that it was a carefully constructed trap. He began to confide in her, telling her about his dreams of leaving the hollow, of the world beyond their small farm. And in those moments, Clara would look at him with a silent, adoring awe, and he felt a kind of peace he had never known. Samuel, the gentle artist, was the easiest to ensnare. Beatrice, the quietest of the triplets, was his tormentor. She didn't offer flattery or desperate need, she offered a strange, detached companionship. While Samuel sketched the knotted roots of the ancient trees or the play of light on the leaves, Beatrice would simply sit beside him in silence. She never spoke of his drawings, never offered praise or criticism. Her presence was a silent weight, a constant, unsettling shadow. But when Elias would find Samuel's drawings and tear them to pieces, calling them a waste of time and an affront to God, Beatrice would find Samuel afterwards, not to comfort him, but to show him a small, careful sketch she had made of his hand or the line of his jaw. It was a disturbing form of twisted admiration. This eerie, possessive mirroring of his artistic soul was a form of psychological control. Samuel, in his innocence, mistook her silence for understanding, her strange mimicry for a bond that transcended words. He felt seen in a way he never had, and the bond, though it was cold and unsettling, was one he desperately clung to. The mother, Eleanor, saw it all. She saw the glances, the lingering touches, the secretive whispers. A wave of silent dread washed over her as she watched her children, once a fractured but distinct group, now becoming a tangled knot of dangerous intimacy. She had tried, in her own weak way, to warn them. "The devil finds his way into the heart in quiet places," she would say, her voice a thin whisper. Elias would dismiss her, claiming it was her womanly vapors acting up, but he too had noticed the change. The boys were quieter, more withdrawn, and the girls, though still obedient, carried a new, almost predatory light in their eyes. One night, the air in the cabin was thick with an unnameable tension. A silence had fallen over the family during supper that was heavier than usual. It was broken by a sudden, violent cough from Samuel. He clutched his chest, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The family watched, frozen in a mix of surprise and alarm, as he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. His fever, which had been a low simmer for days, now raged through his body like a wildfire. Elias, ever the pragmatist, saw it as a test of faith. "A fever of the Lord," he declared, and began to pray over him, his words a harsh, meaningless rumble. But it was more than a fever. Samuel's mind was slipping. He began to speak in frantic, nonsensical whispers, his eyes darting to and from his sisters and brothers, his words a jumble of fear and confusion. He would mumble about a cold hand on his arm, a face in the shadow, and a sickness of the soul. The family, isolated from the nearest town by miles of winding, treacherous terrain, had no doctor to call upon. Elias's stubborn pride would have prevented it anyway. The family's illnesses were a matter for God, not for man. Yet a creeping fear began to take hold. It was not the fear of a common fever, but of something deeper, something unnatural. The twins, Agnes and Clara, looked at Samuel with a strange detachment, almost as if they were observing a failed experiment. Only Beatrice, her face a pale mask of sorrow, looked truly concerned. The brothers, Thomas and Jacob, were filled with a helpless panic, their own internal conflicts forgotten in the face of their brother's suffering. The sickness that had begun in their souls, born of the triplets' twisted game, now manifested in Samuel's fragile body, a grim harbinger of the tragedy to come. The fever raged for days. Samuel's body, once vibrant with the energy of a 16-year-old boy, was now a hollow vessel. He lay in a small cot in the corner of the main room, his face a ghostly white, his breaths coming in thin, reedy whistles. Elias's prayers grew louder, more desperate, as if he could wrestle the sickness from his son with sheer volume. Eleanor's face, already gaunt, seemed to shrink further, her eyes two dark pools of silent grief. Finally, Thomas, unable to bear the sight of his brother's slow decay, defied his father. While Elias was out in the fields, Thomas saddled a horse and rode the long, winding path to the nearest town, a small cluster of cabins and a general store called Cold Creek. The town's doctor, an old man named Dr. Gideon Wells, was a man of science and skepticism in a land steeped in faith and superstition. He had seen his share of strange ailments, but none quite like the one Thomas described. He agreed to come, his weathered face etched with a mix of curiosity and concern. When Dr. Wells arrived, he was a shock to the isolated world of the Winthrop Hollow. He was a man of the modern age, with a medical bag filled with strange instruments and a mind that sought logic over faith. Elias met him at the door, his face a thundercloud of resentment. "We do not need a man of medicine, doctor," he said, his voice a low growl. "We need only the Lord's mercy. And the Lord gave us the wisdom to use what we've been given," Dr. Wells replied, his gaze unwavering. He moved past Elias, his eyes immediately falling on the small, shivering form of Samuel. He knelt beside the cot, his hands moving with a practiced, gentle care. He took Samuel's pulse, felt his fevered forehead, and listened to his rattling breath. He also looked at the boy's eyes, and what he saw there, beyond the fever, was a deep, unshakable fear. "This is not a simple fever, Doctor," Wells said, straightening up. His words were quiet, but they cut through the thick air of the cabin like a knife. "There are signs of prolonged psychological distress. The mind and the body are connected, Elias. What ails the soul can rot the flesh." Elias scoffed, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Nonsense. The boy is sick with a fever and nothing more. You'll give him your potions and be on your way." Dr. Wells ignored him, turning his attention to the other children. He observed them as he spoke, his gaze sharp and calculating. He saw the way Agnes stood, her arms crossed, a flicker of cold defiance in her eyes. He saw Clara, her hands trembling as she held a cup of water, her gaze fixed on the floor. And he saw Beatrice, who stood apart from her sisters, her face unreadable, her eyes following his every move. He also noticed the brothers, Thomas, a solid wall of concern, and Jacob, whose restless energy had been replaced with a tense, coiled stillness. He then spoke to the mother, Eleanor, who looked at him with an almost frantic, pleading desperation. "The boy's mind is tethered to some great fear," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly. "He speaks in riddles, of a cold hand and a face in the shadow." Dr. Wells's mind began to churn. He had heard stories of the strange, isolated families of the Hollows, stories of madness and inbreeding, of old traditions and unspoken pacts. But what he saw here was something different. It was a conscious, deliberate cruelty at play. He prescribed a tonic of quinine for the fever, but he knew in his heart it would do little. The illness wasn't in Samuel's blood, it was in his mind. He knew he couldn't say this outright to Elias, who would only dismiss him as a fool. Instead, he approached Agnes. "Your brother is in great distress, miss," he said, his voice low and calm. "He speaks of a great sadness. Perhaps you know of something that weighs on his mind." Agnes met his gaze without flinching, a cool, practiced mask on her face. "My brother is unwell, sir. That is all." There was a cold finality in her voice that sent a shiver down the doctor's spine. He tried with Clara, who simply shook her head and fled to her mother's side, her body trembling. He tried with Beatrice, who looked at him with a strange, knowing silence, her eyes holding a secret she refused to share. Dr. Wells left the Hollow that day with a grim sense of foreboding. He had given them the medical treatment he could, but he knew the true sickness was not one his potions could cure. The family, a tangled mess of secrets and lies, was a petri dish of psychological torment. Samuel was a victim, a canary in the coal mine, his fragile mind the first to break under the weight of the insidious game the triplets were playing. The doctor knew he couldn't simply leave it at that. His professional duty and a growing personal unease demanded he investigate further. He left the Winthrop home with a new resolve. He would find the truth behind the sickness of Samuel Winthrop, no matter how deep he had to dig into the dark and twisted heart of the family. Samuel's condition worsened. He had stopped eating, stopped speaking, his body racked by tremors. The fever was a constant burning presence, but now a new symptom emerged, a chilling coldness. His hands and feet were perpetually icy, a stark contrast to the burning heat of his brow. The family watched, helpless and horrified, as their youngest was consumed by a sickness that defied all logic. Elias, in a rare moment of genuine fear, retreated into his Bible, reading passages aloud with a frantic desperation, as if he could ward off a demonic presence. Eleanor, her spirit broken, spent her days weeping silently by Samuel's cot, her hands stroking his cold brow. The triplets, however, reacted differently. The strange, quiet rivalry that had defined their game now took on a new, more dangerous edge. Agnes, in her frustration, began to turn her attention to Jacob. She saw his unease, his fear for Samuel, as a weakness she could exploit. She began to find him alone, offering a different kind of comfort now. "You can't save him, Jacob," she would whisper, her voice like a silken rope. "No one can. He's weak, Not like you. Jacob, already burdened by a sense of helplessness, found a strange solace in her words. They were cruel, but they were a truth he was beginning to accept. He began to see Agnes not as his sister but as a kind of confidant, someone who understood the dark thoughts that swirled in his mind. He found himself drawn into her orbit, a moth to a dangerous flame, the forbidden nature of their connection, a perverse comfort in a world falling apart. Clara, seeing Jacob slip away, began to panic. Her fear, once a silent undercurrent, now manifested in a frantic, desperate need for control. She would try to get Samuel's attention, to make him look at her, but he was gone, lost in the fevered landscape of his own mind. Her failure with Samuel and her growing jealousy of Agnes began to consume her. She turned her attention to Thomas, the steady, reliable brother who was Agnes's primary focus. She would find him, her face a mask of sorrow, and she would simply stand there, her presence a silent appeal for comfort. Thomas, who was watching his family fall apart, saw her and felt a profound, almost paternal protectiveness. He would offer her a kind word, a gentle touch on the shoulder, not realizing he was being pulled into a different kind of game, one that was far more sinister and complex than he could imagine. Beatrice, ever the observer, watched it all, her face a blank canvas. She saw Agnes's predatory focus on Jacob, saw Clara's frantic attempts to ensnare Thomas, and saw her brothers, each one a different kind of broken. The sickness in Samuel was a physical manifestation of the psychological rot that was consuming them all. She knew the truth, a grim and horrifying secret that she held close to her chest. She saw how her sister's twisted game was destroying the family, and she felt a strange, cold satisfaction. She was an accomplice, but she was also a victim, a silent witness to a horror she was powerless to stop, or perhaps didn't want to. Dr. Wells, meanwhile, had been busy. He was a man of logic and reason, but he was also a man of the people, and he knew that sometimes the truth was hidden in the gossip and whispers of the community. He spoke to the handful of neighbors who lived on the outskirts of the Winthrop property, people who had seen the Winthrop children grow up from a distance. He heard stories of Elias's cruelty, of the mother's fragile nature, and of the strange, unshakable bond between the triplets. He heard whispers of odd occurrences, of things that were not right about the family. He learned of an incident from a few years prior, a fire that had nearly consumed the Winthrop barn. Elias had blamed it on a faulty lantern, but the neighbors had whispered of something else. They said the triplets, no more than girls at the time, had been seen arguing near the barn just before the fire started. Dr. Wells knew it was just a rumor, but it fit a pattern. It was an act of quiet rebellion, of controlled chaos, a precursor to the game they were now playing with their brothers. The doctor's mind began to piece together a grim puzzle. Elias's cruelty had created an atmosphere of repression and emotional starvation. The triplets, denied a normal outlet for their emotions and desires, had turned on each other, and then on their brothers. Their games were a desperate bid for control, for attention, for a kind of twisted love they had never known. Samuel's sickness was the inevitable result, the physical manifestation of a psychological trauma so profound it had broken his mind and was now consuming his body. Dr. Wells knew he had to go back. He couldn't save Samuel alone, but he knew there was a truth to be uncovered, a family to be saved from its own self-destruction. He had to go back to the hollow and confront the darkness he had seen lurking in the eyes of the Winthrop family. The hollow was a tomb. The air, once thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, now smelled of sickness and despair. Samuel lay in his cot, his body a battlefield of fever and cold. His eyes, once bright and full of a gentle spirit, were now clouded and unfocused, fixed on something no one else could see. He had ceased his mumbling, his final words a chilling whisper. "I am so cold. I am so cold." The family, in their separate miseries, had reached their breaking point. Elias was a ghost in his own home, his prayers now a hollow echo in the silent cabin. Eleanor had retreated completely into a world of her own, her eyes vacant, her hands forever picking at the threads of her dress. Thomas, burdened with the responsibility he was not prepared for, found himself on a precipice. The subtle attentions of Agnes had become more blatant, more demanding. She would find him at the well, her eyes dark with a hunger he did not understand. "We are the strong ones, Thomas," she would whisper, her voice a low purr. "The others are weak. Our father, our mother, and now Samuel. We must stand together, just you and I." Thomas was a man of simple desires, a life of hard work, a family, a sense of peace. The web of strange affection and whispered secrets Agnes was weaving around him was a foreign, dangerous thing. He felt a sense of dread, of revulsion, but also a strange, unwilling pull. He was lonely. He had always been alone, even in a house full of people, and Agnes's offer of companionship, no matter how twisted, was a temptation he was fighting with every fiber of his being. Jacob, on the other hand, had succumbed completely to Clara's false pity. Her desperate need had become his own. He no longer felt the simmering rebellion he once held. Now he felt only a profound sense of loyalty to this fragile girl who looked at him as if he were her only salvation. He would spend hours with her, listening to her fearful whispers, her anxieties about their father, their mother, and the world outside. He had become her protector, a role he had always yearned for, and in his blindness, he did not see the manipulative strings she was pulling. Beatrice, in her silent complicity, began a new game. She had noticed Jacob's dissent, his willingness to be controlled by Clara, and a cold satisfaction had settled in her heart. She began to find Jacob alone, her presence a silent question. She would hand him a small carved piece of wood, a bird or a flower, and in the act of giving, she was communicating a silent message. "I see what you're doing. I know what's happening. I am not a threat, but I am here." She was an unholy confessor, a silent partner in the family's madness, and Jacob, in his guilt and confusion, began to find her presence just as unsettling as his new relationship with Clara was intoxicating. The atmosphere was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning down. The triplets' twisted game, born of a need for control and affection, was consuming them and their brothers, slowly and methodically, like a slow-burning fire. The family's descent into a kind of madness was not a swift fall, but a slow, agonizing slide. Each chapter of their lives a new, more horrifying step down into the abyss. Dr. Wells, having ridden back to the Hollow, found a house that was no longer a home. It was a place of ghosts, a site of a living tragedy. He found Samuel in the throes of a final, violent spasm. The boy's body convulsed, his eyes wide and unseeing, and with a final rattling gasp, the life left his body. The silence that followed was more horrifying than any sound. It was the silence of a truth finally revealed, of a tragedy that had been waiting to happen since the day the triplets were born. Dr. Wells stood in the center of the room, his bag still in his hand, his eyes moving from the lifeless body of Samuel to the faces of the remaining Winthrop children. He saw the cold triumph in Agnes's eyes, the desperate guilt in Clara's, the detached calculation in Beatrice's. He saw the horror and grief on Thomas's and Jacob's faces, a look of men who had just woken from a terrible nightmare, only to find it was a grim reality. The doctor knew then with a chilling certainty that this was no ordinary sickness. This was a murder, a slow, methodical, psychological murder. He also knew he could not prove it. How could he? How could he explain to a community steeped in superstition that a boy had been killed not by fever, but by a family's twisted games? He looked at the family and saw not a group of mourners, but a collection of killers and victims, a testament to what happens when love and power become twisted in a place of profound isolation and repression. The death of Samuel was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of the end. The Winthrop family's slow descent had reached its bottom, and now, in the shadow of their youngest son's death, a reckoning was at hand. The days after Samuel's death were a blur of numb routine and unspoken accusation. The small funeral, held in the family's lonely patch of land, was a desolate affair. Elias, broken by the loss of his son, seemed to have aged a decade overnight. Eleanor's grief was a silent, terrifying thing. She did not cry, but simply stared, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, a woman lost in a fog of sorrow. Dr. Wells, however, was not one to be silenced. He remained in the hollow for a few days, ostensibly to check on the family's health, but in truth, he was searching for answers. He spoke to Thomas and Jacob, not as a doctor, but as a man who had seen too much. He asked them gently about the last few months, about the changes in their family, about the strange sickness that had taken their brother. Thomas, his face a mask of grief and confusion, finally began to speak. He spoke of Agnes's whispers, of her strange, possessive affection, of the way she had made him feel both special and terribly, terribly guilty. She said we were the strong ones, he said, his voice a raw whisper, that we had to protect ourselves from the weak. The words hung in the air, heavy with a new, horrifying meaning. Thomas wasn't just grieving for his brother, he was grieving for his own innocence, for the man he had been before Agnes had gotten to him. Jacob, on the other hand, was defensive, almost furious. He spoke of Clara, of her fragility, of his need to protect her from the world. She needed me, he said, his voice thick with a strange mixture of love and desperation. Dr. Wells saw it for what it was, a self-delusion, a desperate attempt to justify a relationship that was built on a foundation of manipulation and deceit. He tried to explain, to point out the pattern, but Jacob, in his grief and guilt, was deaf to his words. The doctor then turned his attention to the triplets. He cornered Agnes in the kitchen, her hands busy with a mundane task. "Your brother is dead, Agnes," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I believe his death was not from a fever. I believe it was from a sickness of the soul, a sickness you and your sisters planted in his mind." Agnes's hands stilled, but her face remained impassive. "You have no proof, old man," she said, her voice a cold, flat line. "You're a man of science. How can you prove such a thing?" "I don't need to prove it in a court of law," Dr. Wells replied, his eyes holding hers. "I need to prove it to you. You and your sisters played a game. You chose your brothers, and you broke them, one by one. Samuel was the most fragile. He was the first to fall." He then looked at Beatrice, who was watching from the doorway. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but a strange, dark amusement. "You saw it all, didn't you, Beatrice?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You were a silent witness, a participant in a game you did not want to play. You held a secret in your heart, and now that secret is a death on your conscience." Beatrice's face crumpled. She looked at Agnes, then at Clara, who had just entered the room, her eyes wide with a frantic terror. And then she broke. The years of silence, of quiet observation, of complicity in her sister's cruel game, all came spilling out in a torrent of choked sobs and whispered words. She confessed it all, the twisted game, the manipulation, the slow, methodical breaking of their brothers' wills. She spoke of Agnes's cruel ambition, of Clara's desperate need for control, of her own cold, detached fascination with the whole affair. The confession was a brutal, horrifying thing, a mirror held up to the Winthrop family's darkest secrets. Agnes stood frozen, her mask of composure finally shattered, her face a pale mask of shock and rage. Clara, meanwhile, let out a sharp, choked sob and fled the room, her guilt a living, breathing thing. Thomas and Jacob, who had been listening from the other room, staggered back, the weight of the confession crushing them. They had been victims of a slow-burning psychological torture, a game played by the people they were supposed to love and trust. Dr. Wells looked at the broken family, at the fragments of lives scattered on the floor, and he knew his job was done. He couldn't bring Samuel back, but he had given the surviving members of the family a chance at salvation. He had exposed the truth, no matter how ugly. He had pulled the curtain back on the Winthrop's darkest secrets, and now they had to face the monster in the mirror. The aftermath of Beatrice's confession was a maelstrom of recrimination and blame. The fragile facade of the Winthrop family shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Elias, upon hearing the truth from Dr. Wells, was a man consumed by a silent, bone-deep rage. His prayers, once a source of comfort, became a torrent of furious condemnation. He saw his daughters not as his children, but as instruments of the devil, their twisted games a perversion of God's will. He withdrew completely, his presence in the cabin a cold, accusing weight, a ghost of the man who had once ruled with an iron fist. Eleanor, roused from her stupor of grief, found a new kind of madness. She would wander the house, her hands clasped to her chest, whispering to herself. Her whispers were not of sorrow, but of a strange, chilling relief. She had always known something was wrong, and now the dark secret was out in the open. She began to see her daughters not as her own, but as monsters, and a deep-seated hatred began to fester in her heart. Thomas and Jacob, once brothers in their shared innocence, now stood on opposite sides of a new divide. Thomas, his trust in Agnes irrevocably broken, was filled with a cold, righteous anger. He saw her for what she was, a master manipulator who had used his loneliness and his need for validation against him. He could not look at her without a sense of profound betrayal and a chilling recognition of the abyss he had narrowly avoided. Jacob, however, was a different story. He had been so deeply enmeshed in Clara's web that the truth, when it came, felt like a personal attack. He refused to believe it. He saw Beatrice's confession not as a truth, but as a betrayal. He clung to the fantasy Clara had created, his love for her now a desperate, defiant thing. He saw Thomas's anger not as a sign of his love for their brother, but as a judgment of his own weakness. He became a stone wall, refusing to speak of it, refusing to acknowledge the truth that had been laid bare before him. The triplets, once an unbreakable unit, were now a fractured trio, each one isolated in her own private hell. Agnes, stripped of her power and her control, was a caged animal. The cool, calculating mask she had worn for so long had been ripped away, revealing a core of pure, unadulterated rage. She hated Beatrice for her betrayal, hated Clara for her weakness, and hated her brothers for their foolishness. She paced the cabin at night, her eyes dark, her mind plotting a new game, a new way to reclaim the power she had lost. Clara, the timid follower, was now a bundle of raw nerves and frantic guilt. She was terrified of her father's rage, of her mother's silent hatred, and of Thomas's cold stare. She was also terrified of Agnes, who she knew would never forgive her. She spent her days in a state of perpetual fear, her eyes darting from face to face, a living testament to the truth that had been revealed. Beatrice, the confessor, was now an outcast. She was an object of hatred for Agnes and Clara, a source of sorrow for her parents, and a living, breathing reminder of the horror of Samuel's death for her brothers. She had sought to free herself from the burden of the secret, but in doing so she had chained herself to a new kind of prison, one of isolation and profound guilt. Dr. Wells, having delivered the bitter truth, left the Winthrop hollow. He knew he had done all he could. He had exposed the truth, but he could not force the family to heal. He left them to their demons, to the wreckage of their broken lives, a family no longer bound by blood, but by a shared, unspeakable tragedy. The hollow, once a place of quiet solitude, was now a place of perpetual torment, its inhabitants prisoners of their own dark secrets. The sickness of the soul had claimed another victim, the Winthrop family itself. We are now nearing the end of this dark and twisted tale. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video if you want to see the horrifying conclusion to the Winthrop family saga. The confession, a desperate gasp of revelation, had not brought peace. It had brought a new, more profound darkness. The Winthrop cabin, once filled with a tense, oppressive silence, was now a place of open hostility, seething resentment, and a festering dread that was thick enough to taste. The family no longer shared meals at the long, splintered table. They no longer exchanged even the most basic pleasantries, their interactions limited to the bare necessities of a survival that had become nothing short of a chore. The truth had not freed them. It had only trapped them in a new, more suffocating kind of prison, a psychological tomb where they were all entombed together, yet completely and utterly alone. Elias, in his unforgiving fury, had become a judge and jury, a self-appointed executioner of a moral code that had been shattered. He saw the confession not as a burden shared, but as a deliberate corruption of his family, a stain on his legacy. He made Agnes and Clara sleep in separate rooms, away from the boys, a physical manifestation of the moral chasm that had opened between them. His eyes, once stern with an authority rooted in faith, were now filled with a cold, unyielding hatred. He blamed them not just for Samuel's death, but for the ruin of his family, for the perversion of his own rigid sense of religious order. Every glance he cast their way was a silent, damning indictment. Eleanor, her mind frayed by grief and the horror of the truth, began to exhibit strange, unsettling behaviors. Her maternal love had curdled into a bitter poison, and she saw her daughters no longer as her children, but as little more than demons in the flesh who had corrupted her home and her son. She would follow Agnes and Clara around like a silent, spectral hound, her eyes fixed on them, a low, guttural humming sound coming from her throat. She would take their clothes and throw them in the fire, as if she could burn the wickedness from their very souls. Her love had been replaced by a twisted obsession with purification. Thomas, his anger a cold, hard knot in his stomach, began to plan his escape with a chilling, methodical determination. He saw the family not as something to be saved, but as a sinking ship, a lost cause from which he was the only potential survivor. He saw the path ahead of him, a lifetime of festering resentment, of bitterness, of a strange forbidden love that had died before it had even begun. He began to squirrel away food and supplies, his mind set on leaving the hollow, on starting a new life where he could be free of the ghosts of his past and the suffocating burden of his family's crimes. Jacob, however, was in a different kind of turmoil. He had chosen to live a lie, to believe in a twisted version of love that Clara had created for him. He was a man divided against himself, his mind wrestling with the truth he had been told and the fantasy he desperately clung to. He was tormented by the memory of Samuel's final days, by the knowledge that he had been a victim of a cruel, psychological game. He began to drink heavily, a bottle of moonshine, a temporary salve for a wound that would not heal, a fire that burned away the truth and replaced it with a numb, comforting haze. The triplets, in their forced separation, had lost their strength. Agnes, no longer able to manipulate and control, was a hollow shell of her former self. The rage was still there, a burning coal in her chest, but it was now directed inward, a self-lacerating fury. She was a queen without a kingdom, a master of a game that had been taken away from her, and her silent resentment was a constant, simmering threat. Clara, her guilt a crushing weight, was in a state of perpetual hysteria. She would have sudden, violent crying fits, her body trembling with a fear so profound it was almost a physical thing. She would plead with Jacob to believe her, to love her, but he, in his drunkenness and his inner turmoil, was no longer capable of either. And Beatrice, the truth-teller, was a pariah. She was the most despised person in the house, a living testament to the family's ruin. She had sought to bring light into the darkness, but had only succeeded in illuminating the horror they had all lived in. She was a prisoner of her own conscience, and she knew then, with a chilling certainty, that she would never be free. The weather, mirroring the family's descent, had taken a turn for the worse. The endless Appalachian rain had turned the hollow into a muddy, impassable bog. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the outside world. a family entombed in their own misery. The ghosts of their past, of Samuel's death, of the brutal truth that had been revealed, were no longer just whispers in the night. They were living, breathing presences, a constant reminder of the price of their secrets. The Winthrop family was a living tragedy, a testament to the fact that some wounds are too deep to heal, and some truths are too brutal to bear. The rain had stopped, but the cold remained, a biting, relentless chill that seeped into the cabin and settled in the bones of the fractured family. The silence was back, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the oppressive quiet of Elias's rule, but the heavy stillness of a graveyard. It was a silence that spoke of a final, terrible act, of a reckoning that was not just coming, but was already here, festering beneath the surface. Elias, in his self-imposed religious fervor, had retreated to his room. He had been there for 2 days, his voice a low, continuous rumble as he read from the Bible, a man seeking salvation in a world he no longer recognized. The others had left him alone, each one lost in their own private hell, their own self-inflicted misery. He was no longer a patriarch, but a broken man hiding behind the shield of his faith. Thomas, having completed his preparations, had made his final decision. He would leave tonight, under the cover of darkness. He had packed a bag with a small, rusted knife, a change of clothes, and what little food he had managed to squirrel away. He had said his silent goodbyes to his mother, a ghost in her own house, and to his brother, a stranger in his own family. He would not say goodbye to his sisters. He could not, for they were no longer a part of the family he had loved. He would slip away and let the hollow consume them without him. Jacob, meanwhile, had reached the end of his rope. The bottle of moonshine was empty, and in his sobriety, the truth so long denied crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. He saw Clara not as a fragile girl, but as a monster. He saw his love for her not as a noble act, but as a pathetic self-deception that had led to his brother's demise. He saw the ghost of Samuel in every shadow, his final, chilling words echoing in his mind. He was a man consumed by guilt, by a sorrow so profound it had become a physical weight on his chest, a stone that he could no longer bear. The triplets, in their separate miseries, were also reaching a breaking point. Agnes, consumed by a need for revenge and a desire to regain her lost power, had a new, terrible plan. She had been observing Thomas, watching his every move, and she knew he was planning to leave. She saw his escape not as a betrayal, but as a chance to reclaim her power, to destroy her betrayers, to win the game once and for all. Clara, in her hysteria, had become detached from reality. She would sit for hours, her eyes wide and unseeing, a constant low moaning sound coming from her lips. She was no longer a person, but a vessel for a kind of grief and guilt that was too much for a human heart to bear. Beatrice, the truth-teller, was a shadow in the house. She moved from room to room, her eyes filled with a hollow regret. She had sought to expose the truth, but had only succeeded in making her family's misery worse. She was a living testament to the fact that some secrets are better left buried, and that some truths are more destructive than any lie. The final act began as the sun set, casting long, dark shadows on the old cabin. Jacob, in a fit of drunken despair, staggered into the kitchen. He found Clara sitting at the table, a vacant look in her eyes. "You," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl, raw with pain and fury. "You did this. You killed him. We all did." Clara did not respond, but simply stared at him, her eyes reflecting the emptiness that was now her soul. Jacob, in his rage and his grief, grabbed her, his hands shaking with a terrible fury. "Say it!" he screamed. "Say what you did!" The sound of their struggle brought Thomas and Agnes from their rooms. Thomas, his bag in his hand, saw Jacob, his face a mask of rage and sorrow, holding his terrified sister. Agnes, meanwhile, saw her opportunity. She saw a chance to frame Jacob, to have him blamed for Clara's terror, to make him the villain in a story she was determined to write. She began to scream, a high, piercing sound that cut through the silence. "He's lost his mind," she cried, her voice a theatrical wail. "He's gone mad." Thomas, seeing the scene, his mind a jumble of fear and confusion, dropped his bag and rushed to separate them. But it was too late. The powder keg had ignited. The family's psychological torment, their long, slow descent into madness and despair, had finally reached its terrible conclusion. The Winthrops were no longer a family. They were a collection of ghosts, and their house, once a home, was now a tomb. The stage was set for the final bloody act, a horror of their own making. The screams echoed in the small cabin, a desperate symphony of a family's final moments. Jacob, in his rage, pushed Clara away from him, his hands still trembling. She stumbled back, her wide eyes now filled with a genuine, soul-deep terror. Thomas, meanwhile, had turned to face Agnes, his face a mask of furious, disbelieving betrayal. "What have you done?" he said, his voice a raw whisper, filled with the devastating realization of his sister's cruel manipulation. Agnes, her face a pale, triumphant mask, didn't answer. She only looked at them, a cold light of victory in her eyes. The game, in her mind, had not ended with Samuel's death. It had only changed, and she was poised to win. She had set the stage for a new tragedy, a new way to assert her power. But she had miscalculated. The tension in the cabin, the years of repression and resentment, had reached a fever pitch. Jacob, his mind no longer capable of reason, saw not his brother and sister, but two tormentors, two people who had conspired to destroy him. He saw the ghost of Samuel in every shadow, in every desperate glance, and a terrible, unholy rage filled his heart. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, its weight a familiar, comforting presence in his hands. He turned to face Agnes, his eyes filled with a wild, homicidal light. "You did this," he said, his voice a low growl. "You killed him." Agnes, for the first time in her life, looked truly afraid. She had played with people's emotions, with their minds, but she had never anticipated a consequence this violent. She screamed again, a raw, primal sound of terror. Thomas, seeing the glint of madness in Jacob's eyes, moved to stop him. "Jacob, no!" he shouted, his voice a command. But it was too late. Jacob swung the poker, not at Agnes, but at Thomas, his own brother. The blow landed with a sickening crunch, and Thomas collapsed to the floor, his head a twisted, broken thing. The silence that followed was 1,000 times more horrifying than the screams. Jacob stood frozen, the poker still in his hand, his eyes wide with a horrified comprehension of what he had just done. Agnes was on the floor, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and revulsion. Clara, meanwhile, had retreated into a corner, her body curled into a ball, her mind gone, a final victim of the family's psychological war. Elias, roused from his self-imposed prison, came stumbling from his room, his Bible clutched in his hand. He looked at the scene before him, at the broken body of his son, at the madness in his other son's eyes, and at the terror on his daughters' faces. The cold, righteous fury that had sustained him for days finally broke. He let out a low, mournful wail, a sound of a man who had lost everything, a man whose faith had been a lie. Jacob, seeing his father, his brother's lifeless body, and the horror on his sisters' faces, dropped the poker. The fog of his rage lifted, and he was left with the cold, terrible reality of what he had done. He had sought to avenge his brother, to save himself from a life of deceit, and in doing so, he had become a killer. He had become the very monster he had fought against. He fled the cabin, not into the woods but into the hollow itself, a place of perpetual shadow and cold earth. He ran until his lungs burned, until he could run no more, and then he collapsed, his body racked with sobs. He had escaped the family, but he would never escape the man he had become. The next morning, the neighbors, concerned by the uncharacteristic silence from the Winthrop hollow, came to investigate. They found the cabin as a monument to a terrible tragedy. They found Elias, his mind shattered, rocking back and forth in his room, muttering about the devil's work. They found Eleanor still in a daze, sitting by the broken body of her son, Thomas, her mind gone. They found Agnes and Clara, two ghosts of girls, huddled in a corner, their minds broken, their spirits gone. And they found Beatrice, the confessor, who, in her final act of quiet desperation, had taken her own life, a final victim of a truth that was too heavy to bear. The Winthrop family was gone, not from the earth, but from themselves. The Hollow, once a place of quiet solitude, was now a place of silent, terrible ghosts, a testament to what happens when love is twisted, when power is corrupted, and when a family, isolated and repressed, turns on itself. The silence that fell over the Hollow was a final, terrible peace, a silence that would linger for generations, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can be born not from the supernatural, but from the darkness in the human heart.